The morning Fanny Reed told the grain merchant she did not need a single soul's help bringing in her harvest was the same morning Jeremiah Graves stood close enough to the feed store counter to hear every proud, stubborn word she said. Fanny had ridden into Colder Creek, Montana, on a Wednesday in late August of 1882, her wagon bed half full of burlap sacks that needed patching and her purse considerably lighter than she would have liked. The summer had been brutal in the way that only Montana summers can be brutal. The kind that bakes the earth into something resembling fired pottery and turns your creek into a thin silver thread you could step across without wetting your boots. She had lost a third of her corn to a blight that crept in from the eastern field, and the wheat she'd planted in the low ground near the willows had come up sparse and yellow at the edges. She had 240 acres to herself, a barn that needed a new roof beam, a mule named Clarence who was getting on in years, and a daughter of 6 named Bess who looked at her mother like she hung the moon and probably believed she did. Fanny was 28 years old. She had dark auburn hair she wore pinned up under a straw hat, a jaw that people described as determined when they were being kind and hard-headed when they were not, and green eyes that could be warm as a hearth fire or cool as river water, depending entirely on how the conversation was going. She had been on that land alone for 3 years, ever since her husband Thomas Reed had been thrown from a spooked horse and never gotten up from where he fell. She had buried him in the shade of the cottonwood trees at the north end of the property, and she had wept for a month, and then she had rolled up her sleeves and gotten to work, because Bess needed feeding and the land needed tending, and grief, she had learned, did not exempt you from the demands of living. So when Calvin Hooper, who ran the grain merchant operation out of the low brown building on 3rd Street, leaned across his counter and said, "Miss Reed, I heard your wheat came in thin this year. I imagine you'll be needing help at harvest time. I know some men you could hire, or you could ask around at the Rocking D. They sometimes let their hands out for hire after their own work is done." Fanny had straightened her spine to its full height and said, "Thank you, Mr. Hooper, but I will manage my own harvest just as I have managed the 2 before it. I have Clarence and I have my own 2 hands, and that is enough." Calvin Hooper had known better than to push her. He'd watched Fanny Reed manage things for 3 years. He'd watched her negotiate fair prices, fix her own fence line after the spring floods, and drive her wagon through a February ice storm because she'd been out of flour. He just gave her a small nod and wrote up her order. What neither of them noticed, because the feed store was busy, and a man leaning against the far wall studying a list of figures did not draw much attention, was that Jeremiah Graves had heard the entire exchange. Jeremiah was 32, tall in the way of men who'd spent their youth working, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples when the heat got to it, and a pair of brown eyes that were quiet and observant in a way that made some people uncomfortable, and other people feel strangely, like they'd been understood without having said a word. He was the foreman of the Rocking D Ranch, which was exactly what Calvin Hooper had mentioned, and he had come into town that Wednesday for seed stock prices and a new length of fencing wire, and he had not intended to overhear anything at all. But he had. He did not say anything. He was not the kind of man who inserted himself. He paid for his wire, folded his list, and walked out into the blinding August sun, and he thought about what he had heard the whole ride back to the Rocking D. He knew the Reed property. He'd ridden past it 100 times. He'd seen the woman on her own out in those fields, knew she'd lost her husband, knew she was running that place by herself with a child in tow. He knew the wheat had come in thin because he'd heard the same thing from 3 different people in town in the last 2 weeks. He also knew that 240 acres of any crop at harvest time was not a job for one woman and an aging mule, no matter how determined she was. He did not think she was wrong to want to do it herself. He understood pride like he understood the color of the sky. It was just a thing that existed, fundamental and real. His own father had worked himself half to death rather than ask for help from his neighbors, and Jeremiah had watched that and understood it, and also watched what came of it. which was a man who aged 20 years and 10, and lost his farm in the end anyway because he'd been too exhausted to make good decisions. So Jeremiah turned the problem over in his head all through the evening, sitting on the bunkhouse steps while the hands played cards and the cook cleaned up the supper dishes. And by the time the stars were fully out over the Montana dark, he had made a decision. He wasn't going to ask her. He knew if he rode over to the Reed property and knocked on the door and said, "Miss Reed, I'd like to bring my crew to help with your harvest," she would say no before he'd finished the sentence. He'd heard the steel in her voice at the feed store. She hadn't said no to be polite or to perform modesty. She had meant it with her whole chest. But he also knew that a woman alone with a child and a thin harvest and a barn that needed work was going to be in a very bad position come winter if the crop did not get in efficiently. He knew how fast weather could turn in late August in Montana. He knew how many days of good harvesting, whether you could count on before the rains came or the temperatures dropped and turned everything you hadn't yet brought into mush. He went to bed and he slept on it. And at 4:30 in the morning he got up and went to the bunkhouse and woke up his 6 best hands. There were some protests, naturally. Hank Morrow, who was 45 and had been sleeping with one arm thrown over his eyes, said things that were not entirely appropriate for polite company. Pete Vasquez sat up and rubbed his face and asked if the barn was on fire. Davy Cole, who was only 19 and slept like he'd been knocked over the head with something heavy, took 2 full minutes to understand that his foreman was standing in the doorway telling him to get dressed. But Jeremiah Graves had a way of speaking that was calm and direct without being harsh, and within 20 minutes all 6 of them, Hank, Pete, Davy, the brothers Eli and Samuel Worth, and a quiet man named George Tanner who'd been a farmhand before he'd been a cattle hand, were dressed and eating cold biscuits and saddling their horses in the dark. Jeremiah told them where they were going. He told them whose farm it was. He told them they were doing this as a neighborly thing, that he would speak to the owner of the Rocking D about compensating them for the day, and that if any of them had a problem with riding over to help a widow bring in her crop on their day off, they were free to say so and go back to bed. Not one of them went back to bed. The sky was just beginning to go from black to that particular dark blue that comes before the gray that comes before the pink when Jeremiah Graves and his crew of 6 rode out of the Rocking D gates and turned east toward the Reed property. Fanny was already up. She was always up before the sun. It had been Thomas's habit too, and she had kept it after he was gone because the farm did not care what had happened to its people. It only cared that someone showed up to tend to it. She had dressed in her heavy canvas work skirt and her father's old shirt, which she'd taken in at the sides to fit her, and she had drunk her coffee standing at the kitchen window, watching the darkness in the fields begin to soften. Bess was still sleeping. Bess could sleep through anything, which Fanny considered one of her daughter's finest qualities. Fanny put on her hat, picked up her work gloves from the peg by the door, and went out to get Clarence hitched to the harvesting frame. She stood in the barn breathing the familiar smell of old wood and hay and horse and mule, and she ran her hand along Clarence's warm neck, and she felt the weight of the day pressing on her before it had even started. She knew what she'd told Calvin Hooper was true, and she knew it was also not entirely true. She could manage it. She would manage it. But 240 acres was a great deal of ground, and the wheat that had come in needed to be cut and bundled before the weather turned, and she was going to be doing it alone, and that was a fact that sat heavily in her chest no matter how straight she held her spine. She heard them before she saw them. The sound of hooves on the dry summer road was unmistakable, and she stepped out of the barn doorway with her hand above her eyes, squinting into the pale gray of the early morning, and she saw the shapes of horses and riders coming up the long lane that led to her farmyard. Her first thought was alarm, which was a reasonable first thought for a woman alone on a farm in 1882 Montana when strangers came calling before sunup. Her hand went to the barn wall where she kept the long-handled hay fork within reach, and she planted her feet and waited. The riders came into the yard and she counted 7 of them, and then the one at the front swung down from his horse, and she saw his face in the thin light and recognized him from around town, the way you recognize people in a small community without necessarily knowing them by name. She'd seen him at the general store, at the 4th of July gathering, at the cattle auction last fall. "Morning," he said, and his voice was exactly as calm as his face, which was the face of a man who had anticipated that this might not go smoothly and had decided to be steady about it anyway. "My name is Jeremiah Graves. I'm the foreman out at the Rocking D. These are some of the hands. We've come to help with your harvest if you'll allow it." Fanny stared at him. She stared at him for a moment that stretched long enough to make Pete Vasquez, sitting on his horse 10 feet back, shift slightly in his saddle. "I don't recall asking for help," she said. "No, ma'am," Jeremiah said. "You did not. Then I'm not sure how you came to be standing in my yard at sunrise with 6 men behind you, Mr. Graves." "I heard you yesterday at Hooper's feed store," he said, and he did not flinch when he said it, which she found irritating, and also, somewhere underneath the irritation, something else she did not yet have a name for. "I heard you say you didn't need help. And I thought about it all night, and I decided that whether or not you need help wasn't quite the question that mattered." "And what question did matter?" she asked, and her voice had gone to the cool river water variety. He looked at her steadily. His eyes, she noticed, were a very deep shade of brown, the color of the creek bed when the water was clear. "Whether the crop gets in before the weather turns," he said simply. "That's what matters, and it matters to you more than it matters to me. So I figured you'd rather have your crop in your barn than your pride intact and your wheat rotting in the field." She opened her mouth and closed it again. Behind Jeremiah, Hank Morrow let out a sound that might have been a cough and might have been something else. Pete Vasquez looked suddenly very interested in his horse's mane. Fanny took a breath. She looked at the man in front of her, this Jeremiah Graves with his quiet eyes and his calm voice and his crew of 6 sitting in her yard in the gray light of dawn, and she thought about the wheat, and she thought about the rows she'd walked the day before counting what needed to come in, and she thought about Bess who needed feeding and needed a roof over her head, and needed a mother who made good decisions even when they were hard ones. "I don't take charity," she said, and her voice was firm. "This isn't charity," he said. "This is neighbors helping neighbors. It's how things work out here, and you know that as well as I do." "We are not neighbors," she pointed out. "The Rocking D is 4 miles from here. That's about as close as anyone gets out here," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. She looked at him for another long moment. She looked at his crew, these tired men who had clearly been gotten out of bed before they were ready, who had ridden 4 miles in the dark on what was supposed to be their off day. She looked at young Davy Cole, who couldn't have been older than 20 and who was trying to suppress a yawn with absolutely no success. She looked back at Jeremiah Graves. "I will pay for your time," she said. "I cannot pay much, but I will pay what I can." "There's no need," he started. "That is the condition," she said, and her voice left no room for argument. "I will feed everyone a proper midday meal and I will pay a fair day's wage. If those terms are not agreeable, you are welcome to ride back the way you came." He looked at her for a moment, and she had the distinct feeling that he was measuring her, not in an unkind way, but in the way you measure something when you are trying to understand what it is made of. "Those terms are agreeable," he said. "Good," she said. She pulled her gloves on and turned toward the field. "Then let's not waste the daylight." The morning that followed was something Fanny would remember for the rest of her life, though she would not have admitted it at the time. 7 men and 1 woman moving through a wheat field in the blue-gold light of a Montana morning. There was something to it that was almost beautiful in a purely practical way. The Worth brothers worked together with the ease of people who'd spent their lives side by side, moving down the rows in a rhythm that was almost like a dance. George Tanner, who'd been a farmhand, knew the work in his hands and his back in a way the cattle hands didn't, and Fanny watched him work for a few minutes and then positioned him at the head of the worst row, the one where the wheat was densest and most tangled. Hank Morrow was slow and steady and missed nothing. Pete Vasquez was fast and occasionally needed to be redirected, but he took direction without argument. Young Davy Cole was enthusiastic in the way of very young men who are trying to prove something, which meant he worked hard and occasionally knocked into things. And Jeremiah Graves worked beside Fanny herself, in the row parallel to hers, and he did not try to do her work for her, and he did not offer unsolicited commentary on her technique. And those two things earned him more of her respect in the first hour than she'd expected to give him in the entire day. At around 7 in the morning, Bess appeared at the edge of the field in her nightgown with her hair down, looking at the scene with the wide, uncomplicated eyes of a child confronting something new. "Mama," she called, "there are men in our wheat." "Yes, I know," Fanny called back. "Go inside and get dressed, please, Bess." Bess did not go inside. She stood at the field's edge and studied the proceedings with great seriousness. Davy Cole waved at her and she stared at him with the particular unblinking directness of young children, which made him laugh. Jeremiah looked over from his row and smiled at the little girl, a real smile, warm and uncalculated, and Fanny caught it out of the corner of her eye and filed it away somewhere inside her without quite knowing why. Bess eventually went inside and came back dressed, and she stationed herself at the well with a ladle and a bucket, and provided water to anyone who came by, which was both genuinely helpful and also allowed her to interrogate everyone on the crew about where they lived and what their favorite food was, and whether they had ever seen a bear. She was particularly interested in bears. "Your daughter is something," Jeremiah said at one point, when they were at the end of their rows and stopping to drink water before starting the next pass. "She is," Fanny agreed, watching Bess describe what was apparently a very complicated theory about bear behavior to a politely attentive Samuel Worth. "How old?" "6 in October," he nodded. "She's got your eyes." Fanny looked at him. He was watching Bess, not her, and there was nothing in his expression except a quiet, easy warmth, the way a person looks when they are simply glad for the thing they're looking at. She looked back at her daughter and said nothing, but something in her chest shifted very slightly, like a door opening just a crack. By midday they had gotten through more than half the wheat field. It was not nothing. It was, Fanny calculated privately, at least 3 days of her own work compressed into a single morning. She went inside to make the midday meal, and found that Bess had already dragged the chairs from every room in the house out to the porch, reasoning that if there were more people than usual, there would need to be more places to sit, which was entirely correct reasoning. Fanny made a pot of beans that had been on the back of the stove since the night before, and she sliced the smoked ham she'd been saving, and she baked 4 pans of cornbread, and she made a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and she brought it all out, and the crew of men ate with the serious, focused attention of people who have worked hard since before sunrise and mean to work hard again after. She sat on the edge of the porch with her own plate and Bess sat beside her, close enough to press her small shoulder against Fanny's arm, and Fanny ate and watched the men eat and listened to them talk. Jeremiah was across the yard, sitting on the wagon wheel rim with his hat off, and she could see his face properly for the first time without the shade of his brim and without the motion of work blurring the picture. He had a good face. Not a pretty face. It was too weathered for pretty, too marked by sun and wind, and the kind of squinting you do when you've spent years looking at long distances. But it was a face that held together well, a face that had character in it, and it was the face of a person who did not say things he did not mean. She realized she was looking at him for longer than was strictly necessary, and she looked down at her plate. "Mama," Bess said in a low, carrying whisper that was not, in fact, a whisper, "is that man going to come back tomorrow?" "Hush," Fanny said. "I like the way he smiled at me," Bess said, at what she apparently imagined was a quieter volume. It was a nice smile. Fanny put a piece of cornbread in her daughter's hand and said, "Eat." From across the yard, she saw the corner of Jeremiah's mouth move. He was looking at his coffee cup, not at her, but she was fairly certain he had heard. The afternoon was harder than the morning afternoons in August always were, the sun pressing down on everything with an almost personal hostility. But they worked through it, and by the time the light began to slant and go gold and the shadows of the cottonwoods stretched long across the fields, they had brought in the wheat. All of it. The corn was another matter. Some of it was gone to the blight and the rest would need a few more days to be fully ready. But the wheat was in, bundled and stacked in the barn, and Fanny stood at the barn door in the evening light and looked at it and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for weeks. She heard footsteps behind her and turned, and Jeremiah was there, hat in hand, face dusty, looking at the stacked bundles with an expression of simple satisfaction. "That's a good day's work," he said. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true and she had promised herself she would not be ungrateful even if she was proud, she said, "Thank you, genuinely." "I know this was not a small thing to do." He looked at her. In the evening light his eyes were darker, warmer. "It was not a hardship," he said. "I'm glad we could help." She nodded and looked back at the wheat. "I will have your wages ready tomorrow morning. Will someone be able to ride over to collect them, or should I bring them into town?" "There's no need, Mr. Graves," she said, and she turned and looked at him fully, and her green eyes were very direct. "You helped me today and I am grateful for it, but I will pay what I agreed to pay. I am not a person who takes without giving in return. That is not who I am." He held her gaze for a moment. "I know that," he said. "I can see that. I'll ride by myself tomorrow if that's all right." "That's all right," she said. He nodded and went to find his horse, and Fanny stayed in the barn doorway a moment longer, and she watched him go. And she thought about the fact that he'd said he could see that about her, as though he'd been watching long enough to know, and she turned back to her wheat and tried to put it out of her mind. He came the next morning, as he'd said he would, just him and no crew, and Fanny had the wages wrapped in a piece of cloth on the kitchen table. She offered him coffee, because she was a woman who had been raised to offer people coffee when they came to the house, and he accepted. And so they ended up sitting at her kitchen table drinking coffee in the morning light while Bess, who had heard the horse in the yard, came padding out in her socks and immediately occupied the chair next to Jeremiah and began telling him about bears again. Fanny watched her daughter talk and watched Jeremiah listen, truly listen, giving Bess the kind of attention adults rarely gave children, steady, patient, genuinely interested. And she thought about the fact that this man had gotten 6 people out of bed before dawn and ridden 4 miles in the dark to help a woman he didn't know, because he decided the crop mattered more than the woman's refusal, and he'd been right about that in a way that made it hard to stay irritated about. He stayed for about an hour. He talked to Bess about bears and then about horses, on which Bess also had significant opinions. He drank 2 cups of coffee. He and Fanny talked about the weather and the wheat prices and what the fall looked like in terms of supplies. It was ordinary conversation, the kind you have with someone you are just beginning to know, feeling out the shape of them. When he stood to leave, he put his hat on and said, "The corn will be ready in about 2 weeks by the look of it. If you want, I could come by then. Just me, wouldn't need the whole crew for corn, only a few rows of it left after the blight." She looked at him. There was nothing in his face that was anything except what it appeared to be an offer made plainly. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's fair," he said, and he left, and she stood at her door and watched him ride out, and she thought about it for approximately 4 days before she accepted that she was going to say yes. She rode over to the rocking D on a Thursday, which felt like an action that required some nerve, because she had never ridden over to anyone's ranch uninvited to say yes to something she'd previously said she'd think about. But she went, because she had decided that she was not going to spend her life being too proud to receive kindness from a decent person, and that deciding this was not the same as being dependent. The Rocking D was a well-run place. She could see that from the gate. The fences were sound, The barn was solid. The yard was clean in the way that comes from having a good foreman and not just good owners. A couple of hands were working at the corral with some young horses, and one of them pointed her toward the barn when she asked for Jeremiah Graves. She found him inside, doing something to a saddle that required his full attention and both hands, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and something in his expression shifted, quick and real, before he got it settled back to neutral. "Miss Reed," he said, setting down the saddle tool. "About the corn," she said. "Yes, if the offer still stands." "It stands," he said. She nodded once, brisk. "Good. 2 weeks from Saturday, then, if the weather holds." "I'll be there," he said. She turned to leave and then turned back, and she said, without quite knowing she was going to say it, "My name is Fanny. It seems strange to keep saying Mr. Graves and Miss Reed when you've eaten supper in my yard." He looked at her, and the not-quite smile was back. "Jeremiah," he said. "Jeremiah," she repeated, trying it, and then she turned and left before her face could do anything she'd have to explain later. The 2 weeks before the corn harvest were ordinary in their events, and entirely extraordinary in a way that Fanny noticed, but could not quite describe. She rode into Colder Creek twice, and saw Jeremiah both times, once at the hardware store, where they ended up spending 20 minutes discussing the merits of different fencing techniques, and once at the church social on Sunday, where he tipped his hat to her, and then ended up standing beside her for most of the evening because there weren't many people either of them were interested in talking to, and conversation between them, she was beginning to find, came without the friction she usually felt around people she didn't know well. Reverend Claiborne's wife made pointed observations about how nice it was to see Jeremiah Graves talking to someone at one of these events, as opposed to standing at the edge of them looking like a man waiting for a stage that wasn't coming. Fanny took this piece of information and put it somewhere she would examine later. She also noticed, on both occasions, that Jeremiah's attention when it was on her was the complete and undivided kind, as though whatever she was saying was the thing that mattered most in that particular moment. She was not accustomed to that. Thomas had been a good husband and she had loved him, but his attention had always been somewhat scattered, traveling to the fields, to the equipment, to the next thing that needed doing. Jeremiah Graves, when he listened to her, listened with his whole face, his eyes steady and his head slightly inclined, and it was frankly a little unnerving. The Saturday of the corn harvest arrived cool and clear, a perfect harvest morning, and Jeremiah came with 2 hands, Pete Vasquez and George Tanner, and the 4 of them worked through the remaining corn rows in a single day without any drama, which was partly due to the good weather, and partly due to the fact that there was considerably less corn to harvest than there had been wheat, the blight having done its unfortunate work on a good portion of it. But it was also true that the day was easier in general, because the people in it were more comfortable with each other than they'd been 2 weeks ago. Pete Vasquez, Fanny had discovered, was funny in a dry, quiet way that caught you off guard, and he and Bess had developed a rapport that seemed to be based entirely on him, pretending to be completely baffled by everything she told him while she patiently explained it. George Tanner spoke rarely, but when he did it was always worth listening to. And Jeremiah worked beside her again, in the next row, and they talked while they worked, easily and without effort, and she told him about how she and Thomas had come to Montana from Ohio in 1876, when the land was still being opened, and the railroad was just beginning to change things. How they'd chosen this particular piece of land because of the creek and the cottonwoods and the way the light fell across it on an October afternoon. She told it matter-of-factly, without melodrama, and he listened with the same quiet attention he always gave her. "How long ago did you lose him?" he asked, and the question was careful and respectful. 3 years in November," she said. "Was a good man and a good farmer. He would have hated that I've been struggling with the wheat yield." "You haven't been struggling," Jeremiah said. "You've been farming in a hard summer on difficult ground alone with a 6-year-old. That's not struggling, that's just what the circumstances were." She looked at him across the row. He would have said the same thing, actually, she said, and something in her voice went quieter. He was not a man who let me think less of myself for hard circumstances. He sounds like he was worth knowing, Jeremiah said, and he said it without any discomfort, without the awkwardness most men showed when asked to acknowledge that the woman they were standing next to had loved someone else and deeply. He was, she said. They worked in silence for a moment, and then Jeremiah said, I never married. Came close once when I was 25. She decided she didn't want a man who was going to be someone else's foreman all his life. She wasn't wrong exactly about what kind of life it would be, but she was wrong about the man. Fanny considered that for a moment. Do you intend to be a foreman all your life? She asked. I intend to have my own land, he said. I've been saving for it. The Rocking D's owner has offered me a parcel on the south end of the property when he eventually retires, and I've got some money set aside on top of that. Might be a few more years, but it's coming. She looked at him again, differently this time, in the way you look at a map when you suddenly understand the territory it describes. That's a good plan, she said. I'm a patient man, he said. Good things take time. She didn't say anything to that, but she thought about it for the rest of the day. At the end of the afternoon, when the corn was in and the men were washing up at the well and Bess was explaining to George Tanner the precise nature of bear hibernation, Fanny and Jeremiah stood near the barn, and she paid him what she owed, and he took it without argument this time, which she appreciated. You could have a good operation here, he said, looking at the barn and the fields and the house. The soil in the eastern field is better than you're using it for, I think. Better suited to root vegetables than wheat. I've thought the same thing, she admitted. And the low ground by the willows, if you redirect even a small portion of the creek flow into a secondary channel, you'd have irrigation for that section and the wheat yield there would be considerably better. She turned and looked at him with her hands on her hips. Have you been studying my land, Jeremiah Graves? He met her eyes and the not-quite smile appeared. I've been thinking about it, he said. I think about things that seem like they could be improved. It's a habit. And you think my farm could be improved, she said. I think your farm could be the best operation in Colder Creek County in 3 years with the right adjustments, he said. And he said it with such simple sincerity that she couldn't be offended by it even if she'd wanted to be. She looked at him for a long moment. The light was going amber and long, the kind of evening light that made everything look like it was being preserved. Behind them she could hear Bess now asking George Tanner whether bears could count, which seemed to her an entirely reasonable question. You could come by and look at the creek, she said. If you wanted, it might be useful to have another set of eyes on it. I'd be glad to, he said. He came the following Wednesday, just him, and they walked the creek line together in the afternoon, and he showed her where a small redirection could be made with a few days of labor and some basic materials. And she showed him the low eastern field, and they talked about turnips and parsnips and beets. And it was the most interesting conversation Fanny had had in approximately 3 years, which was a thought she did not examine too closely at the time. He stayed for supper. She had not planned for him to stay for supper. It had simply happened the way things happen when you are talking to someone, and the light goes without either of you noticing. And then suddenly, it is that particular dark blue of early evening, and there is a pot on the stove and a child looking expectantly between 2 adults. And the polite thing to do is offer, and the reasonable thing to do is accept. Bess sat between them at the table and talked virtually without stopping, and they both let her talk, and occasionally one of them would respond to something she said, and occasionally they would look at each other across the small dark head of the child, and there was something in those looks, something that was building the way a storm builds. Not visible yet, but you could feel the change in the air, in the quality of the light. After Bess was in bed, they sat on the porch in the cool evening air and drank coffee and talked, and Fanny was aware that this was something she had not done, simply sat and talked with another person, a grown person, in the evening since Thomas died, and that she had missed it in a way she hadn't let herself fully feel until now when it was here. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes, he said. Why did you really come that morning, with the whole crew? She looked at him steadily. I know what you said. About the crop mattering more than my pride, and I believe that's part of it, but I've been wondering about the rest of it." He was quiet for a moment, looking out into the dark of the yard. A barn owl called from somewhere out by the cottonwoods, that low, hollow sound. "Because I heard you say you didn't need help," he said finally, "and I could hear that you meant it and also that it was costing you something to mean it. And I thought, that's a person holding up a weight by herself that nobody should have to hold alone. Not because she can't, but because she shouldn't have to." He paused. "And I thought maybe I could do something about that, so I did." She was quiet for a long time. "That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in a very long while," she said. "I find it's usually easiest," he said. She looked at the side of his face, the line of his jaw in the dark, and she thought about how strange and fine it was that this man had been standing in the feed store at the right moment and had heard her, and had taken it seriously enough to do something about it. "You're a good man, Jeremiah," she said. He turned and looked at her, and in the dark his eyes were very steady. "I'm trying to be," he said. He went home, and she stood on the porch after his horse disappeared into the dark, and she looked up at the stars that were so abundant out here, away from town, that they seemed almost generous, and she thought about what it meant to want someone's company and know that they might want yours in return. He came back on the Saturday after, and the Saturday after that. Sometimes there was a purpose helping her start the creek redirect, or looking at the roof beam in the barn that she'd identified as needing reinforcement. And sometimes there was not quite a purpose, and they both knew it and neither of them said so. He brought Bess a carved wooden bear he'd found at the trading post in town, a small brown thing with a pleasingly round shape, and Bess named it Augustus and treated it with a reverence that made both adults smile. On the third Saturday of October, the weather turned. It came in fast the way Montana weather always did, a front that had been building for days suddenly making its move, the sky going from clear to the color of an old iron pan in the space of 2 hours, and the temperature dropping 15 degrees before noon. Fanny had been outside when she felt the shift, and she knew the signs, and she went straight to the barn and made sure everything was secure and got Clarence in and bolted the doors. And when she came back to the house, Jeremiah was riding up the lane. She stopped and looked at him. "Did you ride 4 miles in a coming storm to check on me?" she said. He dismounted with the ease of long practice and led his horse toward the barn. "I was already coming," he said, without quite answering the question. "Will your barn hold?" "The beam's still weak," she said, because she hadn't gotten to fixing it yet. "I wasn't expecting the weather to turn this fast." "Let me look at it," he said. They spent the next 2 hours bracing the weak beam with materials he'd thought to bring in his saddlebag. He'd thought to bring materials, she noted, which meant he had been considering the barn beam on her behalf in the days before he came, which was the kind of thing that was enormously practical and also enormously tender, and she was going to need to sit down with that thought at some point when there wasn't a storm coming in. The wind picked up while they worked, and the light outside the barn door went to that greenish gray that meant serious weather, and Bess came out to the barn in her coat to find them, and announced that she had put all the chickens in the coop all by herself, which was accurate and impressive for a 6-year-old. And Jeremiah told her so with such genuine admiration that Bess stood about an inch taller. They all went inside as the rain started, and it came down hard and sideways and rattled the windows and turned the yard into a mud lake, and Fanny made stew, and the 3 of them ate at the kitchen table, while the storm did its business outside and the lamp made a warm, small circle of light, and it was one of those evenings that feels complete in itself, sealed off from the rest of the world by weather and warm light and the smell of food. Jeremiah could not ride home in that storm. They both knew it before either of them said it. She made up the pallet in the front room and gave him extra blankets and said good night with a formality that felt like something they were both doing out of respect for themselves and each other. And he said good night with the same formality. And she went to her room and lay in the dark listening to the rain, and thought about the fact that Jeremiah Graves was sleeping in her front room. She also thought about the fact that it felt, in some way she could not entirely account for, natural. Like something that was supposed to be there. The storm cleared by morning, leaving the world washed and glittering and cold in the specific way of October mornings after rain. She woke to find him already up and outside, and when she went to the kitchen window she could see him at the wood pile, splitting wood with steady methodical strokes, laying up a supply that would take her a week to split herself. He'd been up early enough to split half a cord before she'd even gotten her coffee on. She stood at the window in the cold kitchen and watched him work, and felt something move through her that was clear and certain in a way that left no room for argument or management. She was falling in love with him. She let the thought be there. She did not push it away or dress it up or diminish it. She let it be what it was, clear and simple as the October light, and she recognized that it was not the same as what she'd felt for Thomas, because it was not supposed to be. It was its own thing, grown in different soil, tended by different hands, and it was real and it was here. She put the coffee on and she went out onto the porch and she said, "You don't have to do that." He looked up from the woodpile. His breath made white puffs in the cold air. "I know," he said. "Come inside when you've finished a bit more," she said. "There's coffee." He looked at her across the frosty yard, and something in his expression was warm and honest. "I won't be long," he said. He came in when the coffee was ready and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, and the morning was quiet around them, Bess still sleeping, the world outside clean and cold and still. "I have to tell you something," Fanny said. He looked at her steadily. "All right," he said. "I am not an easy person," she said. "I know that. I'm stubborn, I'm particular about how I want things done, and I have a great deal of difficulty accepting help without wanting to immediately return it in equal measure. I have a daughter who needs stability and consistency, and I would not do anything that might disrupt that. And I was married to a man I loved very much, and I am not interested in marrying someone just because the circumstance recommends it." She took a breath. "Having said all of that, I find that I want your company, Jeremiah, very much, more than I've wanted most things in a while, and I thought you ought to know that because I think it's probably already apparent, and I'd rather say it directly than have it just sit there unclaimed." He looked at her for a long moment, and the morning light was full on his face, and she could read nothing in it except a quietness that was not distance but was rather the opposite of distance, a presence that was entirely with her. "I have been in love with you since approximately the moment you said the crop getting in mattered more than my pride," he said, "which I realize was also the moment I said that to you, so that might seem quick, but I knew it then and I've known it every day since." She looked at him. "That was 6 weeks ago," she said. "Yes," he said. "You didn't say anything." "You hadn't said anything yet either," he pointed out, and the corner of his mouth moved. She looked at the table and then back at him, and she laughed, suddenly and fully, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep and genuine, and it changed her face entirely, opened it up, and he looked at her laughing, and his expression went to something that could only be described as deeply content. "You are an infuriating man," she said, when she'd gotten the laughing under control. "Probably," he agreed. "And I think," she said, looking at him with the steady green eyes that could be warm as a hearth fire, and they were very warm now, "that you should come to supper on Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and we'll see what follows from there." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand and held his, and that was the beginning of it, the real beginning of it. The part that both of them would later agree was the moment the door opened all the way. He came to Sunday supper, and then to the Sunday after that, and the Sundays became a pattern, and the pattern became a fact of life on the Reed farm. The way the creek was a fact of life, and the cottonwoods were a fact of life. Something that was there, and that made the place what it was. Bess, who had always been straightforward about her enthusiasms, made her position clear early and often. She had taken to saving particularly interesting bear-related information throughout the week to tell Jeremiah on Sundays. She also took to sitting as close to him as physically possible at the supper table, which Fanny noted with a feeling that was complicated and warm. In November, Jeremiah brought a man from the Rocking D who knew about creek irrigation, and together the three of them, Fanny, Jeremiah, and this man named Fletcher, who had been born in New Mexico and had spent 20 years doing exactly this kind of land-water work, traced out the path of the secondary channel and marked where it would need to be dug. It was a project for the spring, but having it planned was its own form of progress. And that evening, after Fletcher had ridden back to the Rocking D, Jeremiah and Fanny stood at the edge of the eastern field and looked at the markers in the ground, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long while, which was the sense of something being built. In December, Colder Creek had a Christmas social at the town hall, and Jeremiah asked if he might escort her, and she said yes, and they walked in together, and half the town looked at them and the other half pretended not to. And Reverend Claiborne's wife appeared at Fanny's elbow within approximately 4 minutes and said that it was wonderful to see her out, which everyone understood meant something else entirely. Bess wore her best dress, which was green wool and had a white collar, and she danced with Davy Cole, who had apparently made a promise about this at some point Fanny had not been present for, and it was so earnest and sweet that it made Fanny's throat tight. Jeremiah danced with Fanny. She had not danced since Thomas was alive, and she had forgotten what it felt like to be led by someone who knew what they were doing, not a showy kind of leading, but a quiet, sure kind, the kind where you could feel that the person holding you knew where you were going and was confident about getting there. They danced to a waltz that the town fiddler played somewhat roughly but with great enthusiasm, and Jeremiah held her hand and put his other hand at her waist, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the room continued around them in its warm, noisy way. "I'm not going to have my own land for a couple more years," he said, his voice quiet under the music. She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "I want you to know that I'm thinking about what that means," he said. "For the future, what things could look like." He was choosing his words carefully, she could tell, which was something she appreciated about him, he thought before he spoke. "I want to be honest with you about where I am and where I'm going." "I know where you're going," she said. "You told me the day we harvested the corn. You've got a plan and you're working it and you're patient." "I am," he said. "So am I," she said. He looked at her for a long moment and the waltz went on around them and he said, "Fanny." "Yes," she said. "I'd like to ask you something eventually," he said. "Not yet, not until I can say it properly, but I want you to know that I intend to." She felt it move through her, that clear, certain feeling from the October morning, the one that left no room for argument. "All right," she said. "I'll be here." The winter passed. Montana winters in 1882 were not gentle things. They were the kind that tested people and land alike, that drove the temperature down to things that froze the creek solid, and made the mornings a negotiation between the warmth of the bed and the necessity of the stove. But the barn held, the beam reinforced and solid, and the root cellar was well stocked from the harvest, and Fanny and Bess managed the winter with the competence of people who had done it before. Jeremiah came when the weather allowed, and when it didn't, he didn't, and there was a 2-week stretch in January when the snow and wind were so severe that nobody went anywhere, and Fanny found herself thinking about him in the particular way you think about someone when absence makes the shape of them clearer. He sent a letter in the 3rd week of January, delivered by one of the Rocking D hands who had a reason to be in town anyway. It was a practical letter, asking about the well pump and whether she'd had any problems with the pipes in the cold, and giving her a useful suggestion about wrapping the exposed line near the barn. It was entirely practical. At the end of it, in handwriting that was careful and a little square, he had written, "I hope you and Bess are well and warm. I've been thinking about the spring and the irrigation project, and I'm looking forward to it considerably. I'm also looking forward to Sunday." She read that last sentence 3 times, and then put the letter in the drawer of her bedside table, and went to sleep feeling unreasonably good about things. Spring came the way it always did in Montana, slowly and then suddenly, the snow retreating up the hillsides and the creek running high and brown with snowmelt, and the first green appearing in the low ground near the willows. Fanny's spirits lifted with the season in a way that felt almost physical, like a weight being shifted. She and Jeremiah began the irrigation channel project in April, working on it on his days off with occasional help from Fletcher, and sometimes one of the other hands who had been told it was optional, and all of them had chosen to come anyway, which said something about Jeremiah's relationship with his crew that Fanny had noticed and admired. Bess turned 7 in October, and the thing with Augustus the bear had evolved into a full menagerie of carved wooden animals that Jeremiah had been slowly acquiring from various places on his travels through the territory, each one selected with what was clearly genuine thought about which animals Bess had most recently been enthusiastic about. There was Augustus the bear, a large-eared mule she had named Cornelius in honor of Clarence's dignity, a mountain lion she called Duchess, and 3 small birds she called collectively the committee. Fanny kept the letters he sent when he couldn't come in person. She did not examine this habit too closely. In May, the irrigation channel was complete. It was not a large or complex piece of engineering, but it was well made, and it did what it was supposed to do, directing a controlled portion of the creek flow into the secondary channel that ran along the edge of the eastern field, and the effect on the soil moisture was visible within weeks. The eastern field, which Fanny had replanted with root vegetables as Jeremiah had suggested, was showing growth that was considerably more robust than it had been in previous years. She was in that field on a warm May evening, doing the kind of small maintenance work that a new crop always needed in its first month, when Jeremiah rode up and dismounted and came through the gate and walked to where she was kneeling at the end of a row. She looked up at him. The evening light was that particular honeyed gold that May produced, and it was behind him, and he had his hat in his hand, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. "I told you I was going to ask you something eventually," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him, and her heart did something complicated. "The owner of the Rocking D spoke to me last week," he said. "He's ready to retire sooner than he thought. The parcel on the south end that he'd promised me, it's available. I've got the savings to make the purchase. It's good land, Fanny. There's a creek on it and good soil and room to build." He paused, and she could see the effort he was making to say this right, to say it the way it deserved to be said. "It's also 4 miles from here. I've been thinking about that, about whether 4 miles is the right kind of distance." She was very still. "I've been thinking that the right answer is that it shouldn't be 4 miles at all," he said. "I've been thinking that what I'd like, what I would very much like, if you are willing, is for the Reed farm and whatever I build on that parcel to be one thing. For you and me and Bess to be one thing." His eyes were very steady on hers. "I know what I'm asking, and I know it's not a small thing. You've got this land and everything you've built here, and I'm asking you to let me be part of it. I'm asking if I can be the person who's here, who helps with what needs doing, who sits at your table. Not because you need me to. You've made it very clear that you don't need anyone. But because I want to be here, and I think maybe you want me here too." She looked up at him in the honeyed light of the May evening, this man who had come with his whole crew before sunrise because he'd heard her pride and seen past it to the thing underneath. And she thought about all the Sundays and the letters and the wooden animals and the creek channel and the barn beam and the October morning in the kitchen when she had told him she was not an easy person and he had held her hand. "You'll keep the parcel," she said. "We'll have both, the Reed farm and your land both." He blinked. "Fanny, I am not merging into someone else's name again," she said, and her voice was gentle but absolutely firm. "I am Fanny Reed, and this is the Reed farm, and Bess is a Reed. But if you want to build something on that south parcel and call it yours, and if you want those 2 things to be run by the same people together, that makes sense." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's not what most women would say," he said. "I am not most women," she said, and she stood up from the ground and was face to face with him, close, in the warm evening, and her eyes were warm as hearthfare. "No," he said, "you certainly are not." And he reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that made her breath catch, and then he said, "Will you marry me, Fanny Reed?" "Yes," she said without a moment's hesitation. "I will marry you, Jeremiah Graves." He kissed her then in the new-planted field in the May evening, and it was real and warm and sure, exactly the way he was, and she kissed him back with the same honesty she brought to everything. And somewhere behind them, from the direction of the house, they heard a small voice call out, "Are you kissing? Because I told Augustus you were going to kiss, and Augustus said he didn't believe me." They broke apart and looked at each other, and both of them were smiling helplessly, and Fanny called back, "Go inside, Bess." "I'm right, though, aren't I?" Bess called. "Inside," Fanny said, and she was still smiling. "I'll take that as a yes," Bess announced to the general air, and then there were retreating footsteps and the sound of the back door. Jeremiah laughed, a real, open laugh, and Fanny looked at his laughing face and thought that she was going to be looking at it for the rest of her life, and found she had absolutely no objections to that. They married in June of 1883 at the Colder Creek Church, on a morning when the sky was the specific clean blue that follows a good rain, with cottonwood seeds floating through the air like lazy snow. Reverend Claiborne performed the ceremony with a satisfaction that was not entirely ecclesiastical. Fanny wore a dress she'd made from cream-colored fabric she'd ordered from the dry goods catalog, practical enough to be re-wearable, fine enough to be a wedding dress. And her hair was down, which she almost never wore it, and it fell to her shoulders in dark auburn waves. Jeremiah wore his best coat and a clean white shirt, and looked at her when she came down the aisle of the small church with Bess walking beside her, holding Fanny's hand and Augustus the bear under her arm, and his expression was the kind that you don't manufacture, the kind that simply happens to your face when something you have wanted very much is right in front of you and real. Bess had been consulted extensively about the wedding and had opinions about most of it. Her primary opinion was that she wanted a special role, which was determined to be that of ring-bearer, a responsibility she took so seriously that she had practiced walking slowly all week. She delivered the ring with great ceremony and received Jeremiah's solemn thanks with equal ceremony, which was entirely appropriate to the gravity of the occasion as she understood it. The wedding supper was held at the town hall, because the farm wasn't large enough for the number of people who came, which was most of Colder Creek and quite a few people from the surrounding ranches. Hank Morrow and Pete Vasquez and Davy Cole and the Worth brothers and George Tanner were all there, scrubbed up and cheerful, and Hank made a toast that was gruff and brief and somehow exactly right, saying that he'd known Jeremiah Graves for 12 years and never thought he'd see the man marry, but now that he had, he'd say the man had picked well, and that was all he had to say. Sit down. Fanny danced with Jeremiah again, this time as his wife, and it felt both familiar and entirely new, which she thought was exactly how it should feel. After the wedding, the practical arrangements of their life took shape with the same steady intention they brought to everything. Jeremiah's parcel on the south end of the Rocking D became, officially, Graves' land, a compact piece of 60 acres with good creek access and soil that had been resting long enough to be eager. He filed the deed, paid what he'd saved, and in the last weeks of summer, he and some of the Rocking D hands who came voluntarily on their off days began putting up a small house on it, not because they needed it immediately, but because Jeremiah had plans that he and Fanny had discussed and agreed upon. Plans that involved the two properties eventually operating together as a larger enterprise. In the meantime, he moved into the Reed farmhouse, which required some adjusting of the household, most of which was performed by Bess, who reorganized the situation with the efficiency of someone who had been thinking about it for some time. She had already decided which chair at the kitchen table was Jeremiah's, and had positioned Augustus on the windowsill of her room facing out into the yard so that the bear could, as she explained, watch for Jeremiah when he was working outside. The fall of 1883 was a better harvest than the year before had been. The eastern field's root vegetables came in solid and abundant, the turnips and parsnips and beets filling the root cellar to a degree that gave Fanny genuine satisfaction every time she went down there. The wheat in the low ground, benefiting from the irrigation channel, was the best yield that field had produced in the 3 years she'd been farming it. And the corn came in clean, no blight, the cool summer having been unfriendly to the particular mold that had taken the previous year's crop. They brought it in together, she and Jeremiah, with help from the hands and from a neighbor woman named Clara Brecht, whose husband had just moved them to the property 2 miles east, and who appeared one morning with her 2 strong sons to help and stayed for supper, and became something resembling a friend to Fanny, who had not had many of those in the years of managing alone. It was after the harvest supper, with the table cleared and Bess asleep, and Clara and her sons gone home, that Fanny sat down beside Jeremiah on the porch and told him that she expected they were going to need a larger kitchen table before long. He looked at her. She looked back at him with her steady green eyes, and she waited for him to understand, and when he did, she watched his face change in the way that only happened when something surprises you in a way you had hoped for but didn't dare count on. "Are you sure?" he said. "I am quite sure," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder, and they sat on the porch in the cool fall air. And the stars were as abundant as they always were out here, and neither of them said anything for a while because nothing they said was going to be adequate to what they were feeling. So they let the feeling be there, large and full, in the quiet. The baby came the following May, which Fanny considered a perfectly sensible time to be born, spring being a season with appropriate amounts of light and warmth for new things. He was born on a Tuesday morning after a labor that was, as Bess was told later, a lot of work, which Bess took as information without asking further questions, which was unusual for her, but perhaps indicated that she had some intuition about the nature of the topic. Jeremiah was in the house, which was not exactly conventional for the time but was what Fanny had said she wanted, and he was there, not in the room but in the next room, which was about as close as was practical. And when the doctor came out and said it was a boy and that both mother and child were well, the expression on Jeremiah Graves's face was something the doctor would mention to his wife that evening as one of the more moving things he'd witnessed in 30 years of practice. They named him Thomas Jeremiah Reed Graves, which was Fanny's idea and Jeremiah's tearful agreement. Thomas for the man who had loved her and built this farm and left his name on the land she still tended, and Jeremiah for the man who had come with his crew at sunrise and stayed for everything that came after. Thomas Jeremiah Reed Graves was, from the very beginning, a large and interested baby who seemed to regard the world as a problem he was working on solving. He had Jeremiah's dark hair and Fanny's green eyes and Bess's opinion of himself, which is to say, a high one, and he fit into the household with the easy assurance of someone who had always planned to be there. Bess, who had been an only child for 7 years and might have been expected to find this development complicated, greeted her brother with what appeared to be a complete lack of ambivalence and a great deal of practical planning. She decided she was in charge of teaching him things, and she began immediately, which at the age of 2 weeks meant she spent long periods reading to him from a book about the natural world, with particular emphasis on the sections relating to bears. By the fall of 1884, the Graves parcel had its house completed, a solid, well-built thing with a stone foundation and proper windows, and a kitchen large enough to actually cook in, which Jeremiah had made sure of because he knew how Fanny felt about kitchens. They used it as it had been planned to be used, as part of the combined operation. Jeremiah ran cattle on his 60 acres, while the Reed farm continued its crop production, and the two properties together made an enterprise that was, as Jeremiah had predicted, beginning to look like one of the more solid agricultural operations in Colder Creek County. Calvin Hooper at the grain merchant saw Fanny regularly, and had stopped saying anything at all about whether she needed help with anything, which she appreciated. She rode into Colder Creek on a November afternoon in 1885, with Thomas on her hip and the wagon full of late-season root vegetables bound for the market, and she stopped at the feed store for seed stock prices, and she stood at the same counter where she'd stood 3 years earlier and told Calvin Hooper she didn't need anyone's help, and she thought about that, about the chain of events that had run from that moment to this one. And she thought about Jeremiah standing in her barn doorway in the first light, calm and steady, and already certain about something she was only beginning to understand. She thought about the 7 riders coming up her lane before sunrise, the shapes of them in the gray light, and the way she'd planted her feet and waited. Thomas grabbed at a packet of seed on the counter, and she took it from him, and he expressed his opinion on this, and she jostled him and he settled, and she paid for her order and drove the wagon back through Colder Creek with the November sun on her face and the mountains in the distance and her baby on her lap, and she was glad for all of it, the stubbornness and the harvest and the pride and the man who had seen past it. Jeremiah was in the field when she came back, working with Eli Worth on a fence line, and he saw the wagon and raised his hand, and she raised hers, and it was a small thing, an ordinary thing, the kind of ordinary thing that constitutes a life. That winter, he built shelves in the kitchen, the new kitchen, on the Graves parcel, which they used more now that Thomas was there, and the house had become more fully inhabited. He built them on a Sunday afternoon, while Fanny mixed bread and Bess did her lessons at the table, and Thomas sat in the wooden chair with the rungs that he'd been put in for the purpose of having somewhere to sit that was not the floor, and he methodically chewed on the edge of a spoon and watched everything with his green eyes. Jeremiah had brought the wood in from the barn and was working with a quiet, focused competence, fitting the joints and setting the levels with the same patience he brought to everything, and Fanny watched him work the way she'd watched him that first day in the wheat field, with the same sense of something being right about the picture, something that fit. "You know," she said from across the kitchen, "the first time I saw you come up my lane I thought you were trouble." He looked up from the shelf. "Most people would be," he said. "I thought about reaching for the hay fork," she admitted. He smiled at that. "And then what made you decide against it?" She considered. "You dismounted," she said. "When you got into the yard, you got down off your horse before you said a word. That's a respectful thing to do when you're approaching someone's property." He looked at her steadily, the way he always did. "I knew you were alone," he said. "I wasn't going to give you any reason to be afraid of me." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're a good man, Jeremiah," she said, the same thing she'd said on the porch that first evening, and she meant it the same way she'd meant it then and also more. "I'm trying to be," he said, the same answer, but the corner of his mouth moved. "Mama," Bess said without looking up from her lessons, "you say that every time and he says the same thing every time." "Mind your work, Bess," Fanny said. "I'm just observing," Bess said primly. Thomas expressed a view by hitting the spoon against the arm of his chair, and everyone agreed that this was reasonable. The years that followed were full in the way of years that are lived with intention and with good company. The irrigation channel on the Reed farm continued to improve the eastern field yields each season. The Graves cattle operation grew steadily, not dramatically, in the way of enterprises run by a patient man. Bess grew into a young woman who was as forthright as her mother, and as steady as her stepfather, and considerably more interested in bears than either of them had managed to remain, and who at 15 could ride better than most of the rocking D hands and had opinions about soil management that were frequently correct. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious boy who seemed to be interested in everything at once, and who had a laugh that Fanny sometimes heard in the middle of the day when she was working in the field, and that made her stop, whatever she was doing for just a moment. Clara Brecht remained a friend, and they visited back and forth between their farms, and their children grew up knowing each other, which was the kind of thing that made a place into a community. The town of Colder Creek grew in those years too, as the railroad continued to expand, and more settlers came through and some stayed. There were new buildings and new businesses and new people who brought new ideas, and Fanny Reed Graves had opinions about all of it and expressed them at the town meetings she attended regularly, because she believed in the value of showing up to things and saying what you thought. And Jeremiah sat beside her at those meetings with the patient expression of a man who is perfectly comfortable being married to someone who has more to say at a meeting than he does. On the morning of their 5th wedding anniversary, June of 1888, Jeremiah got up early, as he always did, as they both always did, and made the coffee himself and brought it out to the porch. And when Fanny came out, he was already there with 2 cups, and the morning light on the fields and the mountains in the distance, and the cottonwoods along the creek showing their early summer green. She sat beside him and took her cup, and they drank in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who did not need to fill their silences. 5 years, he said after a while. 5 years, she agreed. He was quiet for another moment, looking out at the land. I was thinking, he said, about the morning I brought the crew over. She smiled, looking at her coffee. I think about that morning fairly often, she said. I was nervous, he said. I did a good job of not showing it, but I was. She looked at him. You were nervous. You might have sent us all home, he said. You nearly did. I wasn't entirely sure you weren't going to. She thought about that, about the moment in the barn doorway when she'd been standing there with the hay fork within reach, looking at this man she did not know who had come with his whole crew before she'd consented to any such thing. She thought about the scale she'd been weighing things on, pride and practicality, and the crop in the field and the winter coming. I considered it, she said honestly, for about 30 seconds. What decided you? He asked, and he was genuinely curious, the way he always was about her thinking. She looked at the fields in the early light. You didn't apologize, she said, for being there. You explained yourself and you said your piece and you stood there and let me decide. You didn't try to talk me into it or flatter me or make me feel foolish for having said no in the first place. You just stated the case and let it be. She took a sip of coffee. I respected that. And I thought, if the man is that straightforward about this, then at least I'll know what I'm dealing with. He looked at her with a warmth that had not diminished in 5 years. And what are you dealing with? He said. The most aggravating, helpful man I have ever met, she said, and she said it with such clear fondness that he laughed. I'll take it, he said. She leaned her shoulder against his, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch of the farmhouse that had once been hers alone, and now belonged to their particular life, with the fields and the cottonwoods and the creek, and the 2 properties joined in the way she described in the eastern field that May evening, each one its own thing and both of them one thing, and the children still sleeping in the house behind them, and the coffee warm and the light growing. Bess appeared at the door at some point, already dressed, because she was 15 and had inherited her mother's predisposition to early rising, and she surveyed the scene on the porch with the serene approval of someone whose predictions have been consistently validated by events, and she said, "Good morning," and took herself to the barn to check on the horses. Thomas appeared approximately an hour later, rumpled and deliberate, and climbed onto the porch bench beside Jeremiah and leaned against him in the way children do when they are both still half asleep and fundamentally at ease with the person they're leaning on. And Jeremiah put his free arm around the boy and held both of them, wife and son, in the morning light. Fanny looked at the fields. The summer wheat was showing green across the lower ground, and the eastern fields' early root vegetables were 2 weeks into their season. The secondary irrigation channel was running clear and steady. The barn with its reinforced beam stood solid against the morning sky. Everything she had built before, and everything they had built together after. She thought about what it meant to refuse help and what it meant to accept it, and she thought about the distinction between pride and stubbornness, which were related but not the same thing. Pride knowing what you were worth, stubbornness refusing to update when the evidence came in. She thought she had been both that morning at the feed store, and she was glad that the evidence had come in on hoofbeats before sunrise, quiet and determined, and that she had been the kind of woman who could finally look at what was offered and say yes. The summer of 1888 continued warm and generous, and the harvest when it came was the best the Reed farm had seen since she'd started working it. And Jeremiah's cattle were healthy, and the calves they'd sold in spring had brought a good price. And Clara Brecht came by in September with news that her eldest son was marrying a girl from the new settlement north of town, which led to a supper at the Graves Reed table that went on so long the candles burned down twice. Thomas started school that fall, riding in with Bess on the days she went to assist the teacher, which she did because she had decided she wanted to teach, and had commenced doing so before anyone had formally agreed to it, which everyone who knew her mother recognized as an entirely predictable approach. Jeremiah continued to work the land with the patient, steady intention that had always been his method. He did not rush things. He did not need outcomes to come quickly. He understood that the best things took their time and rewarded the waiting, and he had proof of that sitting at his kitchen table every morning with her coffee cup and her green eyes and her red-brown hair that she still mostly wore pinned up and occasionally did not, on weekend mornings. And on those mornings, he thought she was the most beautiful person he had seen in his life, which he told her sometimes, and she received with a directness that was both accepting and slightly embarrassed, which he found entirely endearing. One evening in October, the same October that Bess turned 15, the same October that Thomas turned 5, and received from Jeremiah a carved wooden horse that was considerably more elaborate than anything in the menagerie, because Thomas had made his preferences around horses exceptionally clear. Fanny sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and wrote a letter to her sister in Ohio, who she corresponded with regularly, who had worried about her when she'd first come out here, and who continued to worry in a more optimistic way since the wedding. She wrote about the harvest and the children and the cattle and the winter preparation, and at the end she wrote, "I know you worried, when I refused to leave after Thomas died, that I was being stubborn past the point of sense. And I know you worried when I took so long to accept what this life was going to require of me, but I want you to know that it has come out well. I am not someone who could have been taken care of and remained myself, and somehow, against all probability, I found a person who understood that, who showed up with his whole crew before I'd asked for any of it and then let me decide, and who has been letting me decide things ever since, while also being beside me when I decide them. I think that is the particular grace of it. I did not have to stop being who I am to find what I was looking for." She sealed the letter and set it for town the next day, and she went to find Jeremiah, who was on the porch in the October dark doing what he sometimes did in the evenings, which was simply sitting and looking at the sky. She sat beside him and he reached for her hand without looking, sure in the way of long habit, and she gave it to him, and they sat together in the dark with the stars above them in their Montana abundance, and the land around them breathing its quiet October breath. And neither of them said anything, and neither of them needed to. The Reed farm stood as it had always stood, and the Graves parcel beside it, and the creek between them ran clear, and the cottonwoods at the north end were losing their leaves in the slow golden way of autumn, drifting down to where Thomas Reed's grave was marked and tended and never forgotten, because Fanny had made sure of that and Jeremiah had honored it. And the man buried there would have recognized what had been built in his absence and would have been glad for it, she thought. The way a good man is glad when the thing he loved is cared for. There was a place in the world for them and they were in it, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything. In the spring of 1889, they added a second bedroom to the farmhouse, because Fanny had told Jeremiah, in the same matter-of-fact way she told him everything, that there would be a third child in September, and they were going to need the room. He had put down the fence post he was holding and looked at her and said, "September." And she said, "September." And he crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and held her with his arms around her and his face in her hair. And she held him back and felt the particular fullness of a life that had been built well. The baby was born in September as predicted. A girl this time, round and red-faced and equipped with a set of lungs that expressed their opinion on being born without any hesitation. They named her Clara, after the friend who had come with her sons to help with the harvest, and Bess held her new sister with the gravity of a person who has studied a great deal about the natural world and is now encountering something considerably more interesting than bears. Thomas inspected the baby with the serious attention he brought to most things, declared her small, and then went outside to tell the horses about her, which seemed to him the appropriate next step. The Reed-Graves family, as they were known in Colder Creek, a hyphenated name that some people found unusual, and that Calvin Hooper had eventually put both names on the grain account without being asked, because it was simply accurate, became one of those households that people were glad to visit and glad to know. The kind of place where there was always coffee on, and someone with something interesting to say, and a child somewhere who would like to tell you about something they had recently learned. Jeremiah Graves, foreman of the Rocking D turned landowner and partner of the Reed Farm, who had stood in a feed store in August of 1882, and overheard a woman refuse help she needed, and had spent all night thinking about what to do about it, and had come at sunrise with his whole crew, continued to be the kind of man he had always been, quiet and patient and straight in all his dealings and deeply thoroughly devoted to his family in a way that showed not in declarations, but in the 1,000 daily acts of showing up. Fanny Reed, who had held the farm alone through grief and hard seasons and had kept her spine straight and her mind clear and her pride intact when it cost her something, and who had stood in the barn doorway in the gray light of an August morning and chosen to accept help because the crop mattered more and the man in front of her was worth it, continued to be exactly who she had always been, which was exactly who she needed to be. They were good together. They were good together the way things are good that are made from honest materials and built with care and given enough time to settle into themselves. They were good together the way the creek and the field were good together, each one its own thing and both of them together, making something that couldn't exist without the other. And on the mornings when Fanny stood at her kitchen window with her coffee and looked out at the fields and the land that had been hers alone and was now theirs together, she thought about all the mornings she had stood at this window before, the hard ones and the afraid ones, and the ones where she had held herself up by the skin of her will and refused to be broken. And she thought about how one of those mornings had turned into the morning. 7 riders came up the lane in the gray light before sunrise, and how everything that was good in her life since then had grown from that single moment of pride meeting its match in something more patient and more persistent and more worth trusting. She had not asked for help. He had come anyway, and she had in the end done the bravest thing she knew how to do, which was to let him. Outside, she could see Jeremiah crossing the yard with Thomas on his shoulders, the boy's hands gripping the dark hair and laughing at the height of it. And from the barn she could hear Bess talking to the horses with the same earnest thoroughness she brought to all her explanations. And in the cradle behind her Clara was making the small contented sounds of a baby who is warm and full and entirely satisfied with the world, which was exactly the right thing to feel. Fanny Reed stood at her kitchen window and looked at her life and thought, yes, this is the thing. This is what you build when you hold on and let go in the right measures, when you know your own worth and also know when to open the door. She finished her coffee and she put on her hat and she went out to meet the morning.